Chapter 5. Unrecognizable Reflections. The shrill buzz of the alarm shattered the fragile veil of sleep, pulling Kirito into reluctant wakefulness. He groaned, blindly reaching out to silence the noise, his hand fumbling across the nightstand. When his fingers brushed against the smooth surface of the device, he froze. The sensation was wrong. Soft. Delicate. Unwarring. Alien. His eyes snapped open, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at the small hand resting on the alarm clock. It wasn't his hand, or at least, it didn't feel like it. The fingers were slender, the nails neatly rounded. Even the pale, flawless skin seemed foreign. "Not again," he muttered, his voice catching in his throat. But the sound that emerged wasn't his. It was light, smooth, and unmistakably feminine. The sound of it sent a chill down his spine, and he clamped a hand over his mouth as if trying to erase the evidence. For a moment, he just sat there, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's just a dream," he told himself. "It has to be a dream." But the weight of his hair, against his neck and shoulders, was too real to ignore. He reached up hesitantly, his fingers tangling in the silken strands. They felt impossibly soft, sliding through his hands like water. As he gathered the hair, pulling it forward, he realized just how long it had grown. It cascaded far past his shoulders, brushing against his upper back, like a curtain of chestnut silk. His hands trembled as he let the hair fall. He didn't want to look. Didn't want to confirm the changes he could already feel. "Maybe it's not as bad as I think," he tried to convince himself, though the thought rang hollow even in his own mind. Slowly he sat up, the familiar weight of his old body, conspicuously absent. His pajama shirt shifted awkwardly as he moved, hanging loosely in some places and pulling tightly in others. The fabric stretched slightly across his chest, and though the change was subtle, it was unmistakable. His chest was no longer flat. Kirito's breath hitched. He pressed a hand to his chest, his slim fingers trembling as they brushed against the soft curves beneath the fabric. His heart raced, a mix of panic and disbelief coursing through him. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible. Swallowing hard, he swung his legs over the side of the bed. The movement felt unnatural, his balance off-kilter as his hips shifted in ways they never had before. When his feet touched the floor, the cool surface sent a shiver up his spine, grounding him in the reality he so desperately wanted to escape. He pushed himself upright, wobbling slightly as he adjusted to the new center of gravity. His pajama pants clung to him, in ways they never had before, snug against the curve of his hips and thighs. The fabric hung loosely around his calves, but higher up, it revealed the undeniable shape of legs that were long, shapely, and undeniably feminine. "No, no, no," he whispered, each word laced with growing panic. He stumbled toward the mirror, his steps light and unnervingly graceful, as though his body had learned how to move without him. His reflection waited for him, silent and unrelenting. When he reached the mirror, he stopped, his feet freezing as though rooted to the floor. For a moment, he couldn't bring himself to look. He stood there, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his hands clenching into fists at his side. "Just look," he told himself. "It's better to know." But when he finally lifted his gaze, the air left his lungs in a sharp, involuntary gasp. The person staring back at him wasn't Kirito. Not entirely, at least. The figure in the mirror was beautiful, painfully, impossibly beautiful. Long chestnut hair framed a delicate face with soft cheekbones and full lips. Large, expressive eyes stared back at him, wide with shock and framed by thick lashes. The features were undeniably feminine, and yet, there was something there, buried beneath the transformation. A faint shadow of who he used to be. His gaze drifted downward, taking in the rest of the reflection. His pajama shirt hung awkwardly on his slender frame, its loose fabric highlighting the narrow curve of his waist. His hips were wider now, creating an hourglass figure that was impossible to ignore. His legs, long and smooth, looked like they belonged to someone else entirely. He raised a trembling hand to his face, his slender fingers brushing against his cheek. His skin was impossibly soft, warm under his touch. He traced the outline of his jaw, his lips, his nose, searching for something familiar. But the harder he looked, the less he recognized himself. "This isn't me," he whispered, his voice trembling. The sound of his own voice, her voice, was like a blade twisting in his chest. He staggered back from the mirror, his reflection blurring as tears welled in his eyes. I'm not me anymore." His back hit the wall, and he slid down to the floor, his legs folding beneath him. He pressed his hands to his face, his fingers curling into his hair as he struggled to keep his breathing steady. But the overwhelming wave of panic was impossible to ignore. "How far is this going to go?" he thought, his mind racing. "How much of me is left?" The memory of the virus's chilling message resurfaced in his mind. Replication 72% complete. He clenched his fists, the words echoing like a death sentence. It wasn't just his avatar being overwritten, it was him. The virus was taking everything, piece by piece, until there would be nothing left of Kirito at all. A sudden surge of anger flared in his chest, cutting through the fear. He slammed his fist against the floor, the impact jarring but grounding. "No," he said, through gritted teeth. "I'm not letting this happen. I don't care what it takes, I'm going to stop this." But even as the determination swelled within him, a flicker of doubt lingered at the edges of his mind. He glanced back at the mirror, his reflection staring back at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "How much time do I have left?" Kirito didn't bother calling Asuna this time. He didn't need to. She always seemed to know when something was wrong, as if their connection went deeper than words. Sure enough, just 15 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. He sat frozen, on the edge of his bed, staring at the door as if it were a barrier between him and the inevitable. His hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling slightly. A part of him wanted to keep it closed, to buy just a few more moments of solitude before she saw him like this. "What's the point?" he thought bitterly. "She'll see eventually." Taking a deep breath, he steeled himself and opened the door. Asuna stood on the other side, her expression shifting from worry to shock the moment her eyes met his. Her amber eyes widened, and her hand flew to her mouth, muffling a sharp intake of breath. "Kirito," she whispered, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her voice was soft, but the two syllables carried the weight of her disbelief. It's gotten worse." Kirito flinched at her words. "You think?" he snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. The sound cracked slightly, betraying the feminine tone that now dominated his speech. He winced at the sound, hating how unrecognizable it was. Azuna's expression immediately softened, guilt flashing in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, reaching out toward him. "I didn't mean it like that." Her fingers brushed against his hair, tucking a strand behind his ear, and the casual intimacy of the gesture made him stiffen. The touch wasn't comforting. It was a reminder. A reminder of how different he'd become. You look. She hesitated, her brow furrowing as she searched for the right word. You look exactly like me now. Thanks for pointing that out, Kirito muttered, crossing his arms defensively. The motion only made him more aware of how his body had changed. The way his arms rested against his chest, the way his narrower shoulders slumped forward. He quickly dropped them to his sides, feeling awkward and exposed. I don't even recognize myself anymore, Asuna, he admitted, his voice low and strained. I'm not me. Asuna frowned, her gaze filled with concern and something else. Something that looked like guilt. She stepped closer, trying to meet his eyes, but he turned away from her. You're still you, Kirito, she said softly, her tone firm but gentle. No matter what you look like, that doesn't change who you are. Kirito let out a bitter scoff, running a hand through his long hair in frustration. The silky strands slipped through his fingers, only adding to his irritation. You wouldn't say that if this was happening to you, he shot back. Azuna's eyes widened slightly at the accusation, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For a moment, the room was filled with heavy silence, the weight of Kirito's statement hanging between them. You're right, she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what it feels like. I don't know how I'd handle it if it were me, but... She stepped closer, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. That doesn't mean I'm going to abandon you. I'm here, Kirito. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together. Her words were earnest, but Kirito couldn't bring himself to look at her. Instead, he stared at the floor, his jaw clenched tightly. Part of him wanted to believe her, to let her reassurance ease the storm inside him. But another part, the louder part, kept screaming that she didn't understand. That no one could understand. A soft chime broke the silence, startling them both. The sound came from Kirito's desk, where his atmosphere lay next to his computer. The allo notification blinked on the screen, a reminder that the others were waiting. Asuna glanced at the headset, then back at Kirito. The others, she said carefully. They're waiting for us. We should log in and tell them what's going on. Kirito's stomach churned at the thought. He could already imagine Klein's teasing remarks or Sinan's sharp, sarcastic comments. Not out of cruelty, but because that's who they were. They'd try to make light of the situation, to joke about it, but Kirito didn't think he could handle that right now. I don't think I can face them, he admitted, his voice barely audible. He sank onto the edge of the bed, his hands gripping the edge tightly. Not like this. Asuna knelt in front of him, forcing him to meet her gaze. Kirito, I get it, I really do, but sitting here alone isn't going to fix this. The virus isn't going to stop on its own. We need to figure out what's happening, and the others might be able to help. Kirito hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edge of the bed. What if they can't? He asked, his voice trembling. What if this is permanent, Asuna? What if I lose myself completely? You won't, Asuna said firmly, her hands resting gently on his knees. I won't let that happen. We won't let that happen. Her confidence was unwavering, and for a moment, Kirito let himself feel the faintest flicker of hope. But the fear still lingered, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. Fine, he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. He stood, walking over to the desk and picking up the atmosphere. The device felt heavier than usual in his hands, as though it carried the weight of everything he was trying to avoid. But don't expect me to enjoy this, he added, managing a weak attempt at humor. Asuna smiled faintly, the corners of her lips curving upward. I wouldn't dream of it, she said, her tone soft but teasing. Kirito took a deep breath, slipping the headset over his head. The familiar hum of the device starting up filled the room, and for a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to focus on the task ahead instead of the reflection in the mirror. Asuna placed her own headset on, her voice cutting through the haze of his thought. "We'll figure it out, Kirito. Together. Always." Kirito closed his eyes as the world around him faded, replaced by the virtual landscape of Alo. Her words echoed in his mind, a fragile lifeline he clung to as he prepared to face whatever came next. The familiar rush of the virtual world washed over Kirito as he logged into Alo. For a brief moment, he let himself embrace the sensation. The weightlessness, the clarity, the way everything in this world felt sharper and more vibrant than reality. But the instant his avatar materialized in Alna's bustling plaza, the disorientation hit him like a freight train. Something was wrong. His balance felt off, his body too light, too fluid in its movements. He instinctively raised a hand to steady himself. But the sight of his slender, delicate fingers only made his stomach churn. He stared at them, flexing the digits experimentally. The way they moved, graceful, almost dainty, sent a shiver down his spine. "It's the same here," he thought, his unease growing. "Even in the game, I can't escape this." Kirito glanced down at himself, and his breath caught. His outfit, a replica of Asuna's night gear, clung to his fully feminine frame. The armor fit perfectly, accentuating the curves he was still struggling to accept. Even the way the fabric and plates moved with him felt alien, the weight distributed differently across his body. "Kirito?" He turned sharply at the sound of Asuna's voice behind him, the motion oddly smooth, like a practiced pirouette. She was standing a few feet away, her expression a mix of worry and awe. You even move like me now," she said softly, her amber eyes wide as she took him in. Kirito frowned, heat rising to his face. He experimentally raised his hand, trying to mimic one of his usual gestures, but the motion was far too elegant, almost theatrical. The way his arm arched and his fingers extended felt unnatural, like he was performing rather than simply moving. He took a hesitant step forward, and the sway of his hips was so pronounced that it made him cringe. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice low but still carrying that unmistakable feminine lilt. "I can't even walk normally anymore." Asuna stepped closer, her gaze filled with sympathy. "It's not your fault," she said gently. "The virus. It's affecting everything, even your muscle memory. Your avatar isn't just copying my appearance. It's mimicking how I move, how I act. It's..." She trailed off, struggling to find the right word. "It's turning me into you," Kirito finished bitterly. He shook his head, his long hair brushing against his cheeks and shoulders with the motion. The sensation was distracting, and he tugged the strands back with more force than necessary, tying them into a loose ponytail. Before Asuna could respond, two familiar figures materialized nearby, their arrival accompanied by the usual flash of light. Klein and Sinon appeared side by side, their casual banter already in full swing as they stepped into the plaza. "All right, what's the big emergency?" Klein asked, adjusting the sword at his hip. "You dragged me out of a raid for this, so it better be." His words died on his lips the moment his gaze landed on Kirito. His eyes widened, his jaw slack as he stared. "Okay, this is downright creepy," Klein said, taking an involuntary step back. He gestured at Kirito with both hands, as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "You're not just similar to Asuna, anymore. You're her. Like, completely her. Kirito let out an exasperated sigh, crossing his arms over his chest. The motion only drew more attention to his new body, and he quickly dropped them to his sides, his frustration mounting. Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out, he said flatly, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Sinon, meanwhile, stood silently, her sharp blue eyes scanning him with unnerving precision. She circled him slowly, her arms crossed, and her expression unreadable. I have to admit, she said after a moment, her voice calm and measured. It's impressive. The level of detail is uncanny. You're like her perfect twin. Kirito turned to glare at her, his cheeks flushing. Great. Glad everyone's so impressed. Klein, apparently missing, or ignoring the tension in Kirito's voice, let out a low whistle. I mean, seriously, if I didn't know better, I'd swear you were Asuna. The hair, the face, He trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward Kirito's body. Kirito's glare darkened. Don't finish that sentence. Klein raised his hands defensively, though a teasing grin tugged at his lips. Hey, I'm just saying, you've got the whole look down. Maybe we should start calling you Kiri-chan? The nickname hit a nerve. Kirito's eyes narrowed dangerously, and he took a step toward Klein, his movements unnervingly graceful despite his irritation. Don't you dare, he growled, his voice sharper than he intended. The sound only seemed to amuse Klein further. Whoa, easy there, Kiri-chan, he said, holding his hands up in mock surrender. No need to get your armor in a twist. Asuna shot Klein a warning look, stepping between him and Kirito. Klein, knock it off, she said firmly. This isn't a joke. The playful glint in Klein's eyes faded, replaced by a flicker of guilt. All right, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Sorry, Kirito. I didn't mean anything by it. Kirito sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. It's fine, he muttered, though his voice was tight. Let's just focus on why we're here. Sinon stepped forward, her expression softening slightly. Kirito, she said, her voice quieter now. How are you holding up? Really? Kirito hesitated, caught off guard by the sincerity in her tone. He glanced at her, then at Asuna, who was watching him with the same concerned expression. For a moment, he considered brushing it off, deflecting with a joke or a sarcastic comment. But the weight of everything, the changes, the uncertainty, the fear, was too much to ignore. He paused, his shoulders slumping. I don't know. It's like I'm losing pieces of myself, bit by bit. Every time I log in, every time I look in the mirror, it's like I'm disappearing. The admission hung in the air, heavy and raw. Asuna placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but reassuring. You're not disappearing, she said softly. We're going to figure this out, Kirito. I promise? Sinon nodded, her gaze steady. We'll stop the virus, whatever it takes. Klein stepped forward, his usual flippant demeanor replaced by rare seriousness. Yeah, man. You're still you, no matter what. Don't forget that. Kirito looked at each of them in turn, their words sinking in despite the lingering doubt in his mind. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stand a little taller, even as the unfamiliar weight of his body made the action feel strained. All right, he said finally. Let's get to work. The group wasted no time diving into the investigation. Agil, always the reliable strategist, had tracked down another lead. Encrypted data logs buried deep within one of the game's older, less traveled dungeons. According to him, The logs were rumored to hold crucial information about the virus origin, answers they desperately needed. As they prepared for the journey, Kirito couldn't help but feel the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on him. It wasn't just about finding answers anymore. This virus wasn't just rewriting code. It was rewriting him. The idea of losing himself completely gnawed at the edges of his mind, a constant, suffocating presence. The trek to the dungeon was relatively uneventful, though Kirito found little comfort in the calm. The streets of Aon were bustling as usual, but Kirito couldn't ignore the looks he kept receiving from passing players. "Hey Asuna!" A cheerful voice called from across the plaza. "Tarani." Kirito stiffened. Ah? He didn't even bother turning around this time. It was the third time someone had mistaken him for Asuna in the past 10 minutes, and each instance made his frustration grow. "Wow, Asuna, your outfit looks amazing," another player said, waving as they walked by. Kirito clenched his teeth, his fists tightening at his sides. "I'm not Asuna." He wanted to scream, but he bit his tongue. Drawing attention would only make things worse. Even so, the constant reminders of his transformation were like tiny needles pricking at his already frayed nerves. Asuna, walking beside him, noticed his tension. "Kirito?" she began, her voice laced with concern. "I'm fine," he said curtly, not meeting her gaze. She hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but she let it drop. The dungeon itself loomed ahead of them not long after. A dark and foreboding cave system, carved into the side of a jagged cliff. The entrance was framed by twisted, overgrown vines, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed from within. A warning popped up on their HUDs, signaling that this was a high-level area meant for experienced players. "Cozy," Klein muttered, peering into the abyss. "Let's just get this over with," Kirito said, stepping forward without waiting for the others. His movements were purposeful, but the way his hips swayed slightly with each step still felt unnatural to him. He could feel the others watching, though none of them said anything. The dungeon was eerily quiet as they descended, their footsteps echoing off the damp stone walls. The air grew colder the deeper they went, and the faint glow of bioluminescent moss provided just enough light to guide their way. "Anyone else getting bad vibes from this place?" Klein asked, gripping his sword tightly. Sinan rolled her eyes. "It's a dungeon, Klein. What did you expect? Sunshine and rainbows?" "Hey, I'm just saying, it's got that whole something's about to jump out and kill us vibe." "Focus," Kirito said sharply, his voice cutting through their banter. After what felt like an eternity of navigating narrow corridors and avoiding the occasional trap, they finally reached a hidden chamber deep within the dungeon. The room was circular, with intricate carvings etched into the walls, depicting scenes of battle and strange abstract symbols. In the center of the room was a pedestal, glowing faintly with an eerie blue light. Agil approached the pedestal cautiously, his massive frame seeming out of place in the delicate ancient chamber. He tapped a few commands into his HUD, and the glow intensified as lines of code began scrolling across the air in front of them. "This is it," Agil said, his brow furrowing as he studied the data. "The logs confirm it. The virus isn't just some random glitch. It's tied to a rogue AI embedded in the game's core systems. And get this, it was designed specifically to protect Asuna's data." "Protect my data?" Asuna repeated, stepping closer. Her frown deepened, confusion clear in her amber eyes. Why would anyone create something like that? Agil shrugged, still scrolling through the code. "Could have been a failsafe. Maybe someone wanted to make sure your data couldn't be corrupted or lost. But something went wrong. The eye's gone haywire. Instead of protecting your data, it's replicating it, and overriding Kirito's in the process. Kirito's stomach dropped. He clenched his fists so tightly, his nails dug into his palms. So, this thing is turning me into Asuna on purpose? He asked, his voice low but taut with barely restrained anger. That's what it looks like, Agil replied grimly, his expression serious. Sinon tilted her head, her sharp blue eyes narrowing as she processed the information. If the AI is using Asuna's data as a template, then maybe it sees Kirito as a threat to her. Or, she hesitated, her voice growing quieter. Maybe it's trying to replace her. Replace me? Asuna repeated, her tone incredulous. She shook her head, her chestnut hair swaying with the motion. Oh, that doesn't make sense. Why would it replace me with Kirito? And why him specifically? Klein raised a hand, like a student in class. Maybe because he's always glued to your side? The AI might have figured you're linked, so it just picked him. That's not funny, Kirito snapped, glaring at him. Wasn't trying to be? Klein said, holding his hands up defensively. Just saying, it's a weird AI. Who knows how it thinks? We'll have to ask it ourselves, Agil interrupted, his deep voice cutting through the tension. He gestured to the map that had appeared on his HUD. The logs reference a place called the Sanctuary of Echoes. It's deep in the outskirts of the game world, past areas no one ever goes to anymore. That's where the AI is located. Kirito stared at the map, his jaw tightening. The name alone sent a shiver down his spine, as if the place itself carried the weight of something ancient and dangerous. So, what's the plan? Sinon asked, her tone calm but focused. Agil looked at Kirito. That depends. You're the one it's targeting, Kirito. Are you ready to confront it? Kirito hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. And was he ready? Could he face the thing that was slowly erasing him, piece by piece? He wasn't sure. But what choice did he have? I don't have a choice, do I? Kirito said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside him. Asuna stepped forward, her hand brushing against his arm. You're not doing this alone, she said firmly. We're all in this together. Klein grinned, resting his sword on his shoulder. Yeah, no way we're letting some glitchy AI mess with our party leader. Sinon adjusted her bow, her sharp gaze unwavering. If it's a fight, I'm ready. Kirito looked at each of them, their determination shining through despite the danger ahead. For the first time in what felt like days, a small spark of hope lit within him. All right, he said, nodding. Let's go find this AI and end this. As the group prepared to set out for the Sanctuary of Echoes, Kirito couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread, settling like a stone in his chest. It had been lingering there for days, but now it felt heavier, more suffocating, as if the very air around him bore the weight of what lay ahead. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his gauntlet, a nervous habit he didn't even realize he'd picked up until Asuna's voice cut through the silence. Kirito? She asked gently, stepping closer. Her amber eyes searched his face, looking for a crack in the mask he was trying so hard to hold together. Are you ready? He hesitated, glancing at her before quickly looking away. The answer was no. He wasn't ready, not for this, not for anything. His body didn't even feel like his own anymore. Every time he moved, it felt wrong, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. The fluidity, the grace, even the slight sway of his hips, It all served as a constant reminder of how far he'd already changed. But what choice did he have? Yeah, he lied, his voice quieter than he intended, but still carrying that frustratingly melodic lilt he couldn't shake. Asuna didn't look convinced, but she didn't press him. Instead, she reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. "We'll stop this," she said softly. "No matter what it takes." Kirito forced a small nod, but her reassurance felt hollow. Deep down, he couldn't stop the nagging thought that this might not be something they could stop. As the group gathered in a circle to prepare for the teleportation, Klein tried to lighten the mood, as he always did. "All right, team, let's do this thing. Rogue AI, mysterious sanctuary, creepy vibes. Sounds like just another day for us." He grinned, clearly hoping to get at least a chuckle from someone. Sinon raised an eyebrow, her expression flat. "If you're trying to make this sound less ominous, you're failing." "Come on, Sinon," Klein said, wagging a finger at her. "Where's your sense of adventure?" "I left it behind when we started chasing after an AI that's rewriting Kirito's body like it's some kind of character customization screen," she replied dryly. Klein winced, scratching the back of his neck. "Okay, fair point." Kirito barely heard the exchange. His attention was fixed on his hands, which rested lightly at his side. They were small, delicate, and unmistakably feminine. He turned them over slowly, studying the slender fingers and soft, unblemished skin that seemed so alien to him. "These aren't my hands," he thought bitterly, clenching them into fists. The motion felt weak, as if his grip had lost its strength. It was another reminder of how much he'd already lost, and how much more he stood to lose if they failed. "Kirito." Agil's deep voice broke through his thoughts. The merchant-turned warrior stood nearby, his imposing frame a stark contrast to the quiet concern in his tone. "You good?" Kirito didn't answer right away. He forced himself to unclench his fists and looked up at the group. Asuna, Klein, Sinon and Agil were all watching him, their expressions ranging from worry to quiet determination. They were waiting for him to lead, as he always did. "I'm fine," he said finally, though the words felt hollow even to him. He straightened his posture, trying to project an air of confidence he didn't feel. "Let's get this over with." The group nodded, and Asuna activated the teleportation crystal. A bright light enveloped them, and for a moment, everything was weightless and still. When the light faded, they found themselves standing on the edge of a desolate wasteland. The air was thick and heavy, carrying a faint, unnatural hum that made the hairs on the back of Kirito's neck stand on end. The ground beneath their feet was cracked and barren, with jagged rocks jutting out like the broken bones of the earth. In the distance, the sanctuary echoes loomed, a massive, ancient structure carved into the side of a mountain. Its architecture was otherworldly, with twisting spires and glowing runes etched into its surface. The entire place seemed to pulse faintly, as if it were alive. "Well," Klein said, breaking the silence, "that's not creepy at all." "Stay focused," Sinon said, her bow already in her hands, an arrow notched and ready. Her sharp eyes scanned the horizon for any signs of movement. Kirito took a step forward, his boots crunching against the cracked earth. The weightless grace of his movement still felt wrong, but he forced himself to push past it. He couldn't afford to dwell on his discomfort, not now. As they approached the sanctuary, Kirito felt the dread in his chest deepen. It wasn't just fear, it was something more primal, a sense of impending doom that seemed to radiate from the structure itself. "This has to end," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. Asuna, walking beside him, glanced at him with concern. "It will," she said firmly, her voice steady. "We'll make sure of it." Kirito didn't respond. He wanted to believe her, but the doubt gnawed at him, like a relentless parasite. What if they couldn't stop the AI? What if the transformation couldn't be reversed? What if this was just who he was now? He clenched his fists again, his nails digging into his palms. No, he couldn't think like that. They would stop this. They had to. As they reached the sanctuary's entrance, a massive rune-inscribed door that seemed to hum with energy, Agile stepped forward, examining the carvings. "These runes," he murmured, his brow furrowing. "They're not just decorative. They're part of the system. This whole place is like one big circuit." "Can you open it?" Sinan asked, her gaze flicking between the door and the surrounding area. Agil nodded slowly. "Yeah, but I'm guessing it won't be quiet." "Then we'd better be ready for company," Kirito said, drawing his sword. The familiar weight in his hand was one of the few things that still felt right. Asuna unsheathed her rapier, standing at his side. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Agil placed his hand on the door, and the runes began to glow brighter, pulsing in time with the low hum that filled the air. The ground beneath them trembled as the massive door began to creak open, revealing a dark, yawning void beyond. A cold wind rushed out from the entrance, carrying with it a faint whisper. A sound that sent chills down Kirito's spine. "What the hell was that?" Klein asked, his voice tense. Kirito didn't answer. He stepped forward, peering into the darkness. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, their words just out of reach. "We don't have a choice," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. He tightened his grip on his sword and stepped into the void. The others followed close behind, their weapons drawn and their eyes scanning the shadows. As the darkness closed in around them, Kirito couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. And somewhere, deep within the sanctuary, the rogue AI was waiting for him.